Well, welcome to this lecture on Buddhist theory of mind. My name is Zoltan DNS. You pronounce my last name, like the letters DNS. DNS. So what I'd like to do is just tell you something about how old Buddhist suttas, going back 2,500 years, saw the human mind. Because some of the ideas developed way back then have become, there's renewed interest in them within the field of clinical psychology, and they're having an impact on particular treatments. And you've probably heard about mindfulness in all sorts of contexts, in education, in business, and so on. So what I'd like to do is to go through how Gautama, who was the person who became called the Buddha, saw the human mind, and how he thought that way of looking at the mind would be helpful to people flourishing. In other words, living a full and good life. And so what I'm doing here is, I'm not a Buddhist myself, I'm just extracting some of the psychology that was there that I've found interesting and useful, and actually matches a modern-day understanding of the mind in many respects within psychology or cognitive science. So this is the claim that I'm going to consider in this lecture. According to Gautama, we suffer because we have an illusion. We see things incorrectly, and that illusion goes deep into our thinking. And so what we need to do, if we want to flourish, is to get rid of that illusion. And the illusion, he says, is to do with how we see who we are, how we understand at rock bottom who we are. So start with a question, which might look a bit silly, but try and get your head around it just a little bit, because it will then enable us to move on. So perhaps just tell a person next to you whether you think you're the very same person as you were 5 minutes ago. Let's try that now. What do you think about that? Are you the same person as you were 5 minutes ago? All right, so on the one hand, you might say, well, of course I'm the same person as 5 minutes ago. You know, I'm Bill, I'm still Bill, or whatever. Or you might say, but on the other hand, I could say, well, I'm a bit different. I might have, have the odd different thought, or there's something maybe a tiny bit different about me. Maybe if we went back 5 years, you might think, on the one hand, yes, I am the same person, obviously. But on the other hand, I think things differently, have different beliefs, and so on the other hand, maybe I'm a different person. But even if in some respects you're a different person, do you think there's some part of you that remains the same and makes you you? I mean, why is it that you're you, precisely the person you are? I mean, it makes a difference that you're you, right? If you are going to be tortured, or someone else was going to be tortured, of course, it's not nice that someone else is being tortured, but there's a world of difference between someone else and you being tortured, right? There's something very special about you. But what makes you you? Is there some part of you that's identical, that's exactly the same, the you of you that makes you you? Do you understand the question? Just say your reaction to the person next to you, is there some part of you that's identical from moment to moment that makes you you? What do you reckon? Now, what I take Gautama to be saying is we do have this intuition, just as human beings we have the intuition, that there is a me here, and it's the same me over time. I mean, things might change. I might change my beliefs about things and my habits and so on, but nonetheless there is some me-ness that carries on identically over time that makes me me from one moment to the next, and hence, because it's one moment to the next, from 1 week to the next, from 1 year to the next, and over your whole life. Now, maybe surprisingly, he thought this was the root of all sufferings. It will take a while to get there. And he also thought it was an illusion. There is no identical you that persists over time. So what could this, given you can notice some intuition within you that there is some self to you, there is something that persists identically, I mean, unchanging over time, that makes you you, what could it be? So what Gautama then does is he goes through the things that meant to be a more or less exhaustive list of the things a person might consider that makes them themselves. And so this is, I guess, the first part of a Buddhist theory of mind, is to break the mind of the person up into these components, and I think it's a fairly complete list. I mean, psychology now might break up the mind in a slightly different way, but in terms of the goal that he had in mind, that is trying to penetrate this illusion, it does rather well. So the first thing you might say is, well, what makes me and what's the same over time is the physical stuff of which I am made. And these days, maybe not 2,500 years ago, but these days would say, especially the brain. Right? You say, well, it's the same brain, right? My brain persists over time, and, well, that's me. I'm going to consider that argument in a little bit more detail after this slide, but for now I just want to point out that all the physical stuff of which you are made is changing all the time. And if there's one thing we've sort of found in science about bodies is just how much is changing all the time. You know, how often you lose, just by doing that, you're losing skin cells which are regenerating all the time. All the cells of your body, well, in a lot of your organs, you're losing cells all the time and completely regenerating them over relatively short periods of time. Brain cells, not quite so much after age 21. We don't regenerate new cells so much, but we do, within the cell, there's a constant process of replacement of molecules and atoms and things being substituted and essentially rebuilt. And of course, within the brain itself is always changing. The connections between the neurons, they're dying away, they're forming, and so the shape of the brain itself is in a constant state of flux. Now, what we might say is, as a consequence of that is, if you believe the brain underlies all of your mental life, then as the brain changes, we should see this in changes in all of your mental life. And you might say, well, it's not so much the exact brain, you know, we're changing atoms and things all the time, but the brain gives rise to, say, feelings and perceptions and so on, and there's something about that that is relatively constant. So Gautama goes on to consider aspects of your mental life beyond your physical form, including feelings. Feelings in some way determine who you are. I mean, if you're in a jealous mode, and the feeling is jealousy, then you do behave in a rather different way than if you're in a very happy mode, right? You tend to do different things, and you believe different things, and you relate to people in different ways. Maybe as if you're a different person, depending on the underlying feelings that are dominating. But for a feeling to be you, there must be some feeling that's unchanged, some background feeling that's always there all the time. But what feeling can that be? What feeling is always there? So there's no feeling, Gautama would say, and part of his argument practices of observing yourself to see every feeling that arises passes away. Well, what about perceptions? Some way you feel you're you because of the way you see the world, including just looking at the world. It seems to localize me somewhere. Here, maybe. Just maybe back a bit here, but somewhere round about here. My perception localizes me somewhere. But that's always changing. Right? There's nothing constant about that. And the way you look at the world, you might say, I'm the sort of person I am, could include something fairly abstract like beliefs, like, you know, you have certain political beliefs or religious beliefs or liberal beliefs or whatever they are, and you say, that's me, I couldn't be different from that. But they change too, and they can change. What about volitions? You might say, that which makes decisions, that's me. The bit of me involved with willpower, choice, that's me. But the way you make choices, and the choices you make, they change too. There's always fluctuating. What about consciousness? What about the sheer raw awareness behind it all? The awareness of your mental states. Well, what Gautama says about that, the content of your consciousness is always consciousness of something. And if everything else is changing, your perceptions, your volitions, your beliefs, and so on, consciousness is always changing. So each of these things, these divisions that Gautama divides the mind up into, he wants us to realize, perhaps with some introspection through particular meditative practices, that whenever you notice any experience of any of these things here, experiences come and they go, and nothing stays the same. Now, I just want to dwell on this a little bit more to show how the conclusions fit in very well with an Oxford philosopher called Derek Parfit. He wrote this book, Reasons and Persons. He didn't publish very much, by the way. I looked him up on Google Scholar, and he's, over the last several decades, he published about 9 things. But he invented a whole new field of philosophy. He rewrote another field. So he completely transformed the philosophical landscape. He was an interesting character who was utterly obsessed with philosophy. So he, in order to cut out everything in life that might waste time, he ate only raw food, sort of nuts and vegetables, so he could eat it quickly. He had instant coffee, which he would just pour water in from the cup, from the tap, so he could drink it. And he'd have his books open on his sock drawer. So when he's putting socks on, he could be reading. So he was extremely intense and on the autistic spectrum, it turns out. And maybe that helped, that obsession from being on the spectrum helped him penetrate a few problems in ways that other people hadn't. Well, he came up with a conclusion that was very similar to the Buddhist one, that there is no self there, above and beyond a just changing, connected mental states. In his book, which is actually quite readable, chapters 9, 10, and 11, 9, 10, 11, and 12 are on this no self. There's a tiny bit at the back saying this happens to match Buddhist philosophy, but he didn't come from that direction. He just came to the same conclusions. And there's a story of a philosopher who happened to be trekking in Ladakh in northern India, which borders on Tibet and was part of old Tibet. And his guide was a Buddhist scholar. And they were talking about philosophy, and this philosopher said, well, this Buddhism you're talking about is so similar to what Derek Parfit is talking about, and gave the guide a copy of Reasons and Persons. And when he went back some years later, he found the book had ended up in the hands of an abbot of the Buddhist Tibetan monastery, and they were chanting chapters from the book and debating it as now part of their curriculum. Now, Derek Parfit himself says about, incidentally, he died 1st of January of this year. He says something you rarely hear from Oxford philosophers. You probably haven't had a chance yet to read Oxford philosophy. It's pretty inscrutable, dense stuff. And you don't normally hear things like this. But this is what he says in the book. His conclusion, which in Buddhism we call the no-self doctrine, is liberating. Before I seemed imprisoned in myself. My life seemed like a glass tunnel, at the end of which there was darkness. I now live in the open air. Other people are closer. I'm more concerned about the lives of others. And now I've seen this, my death seems to me less bad. So that's, I find, quite an extraordinary conclusion from a bit of philosophy. Now, I'm going to read this out to you. These are some what philosophers call thought experiments to help motivate, or in other words, to encourage you to come to certain conclusions. So this is to think about who you are and about, is there any identical self to you? So imagine this. I enter the teletransporter. I have been to Mars before, but only by the old method, a spaceship journey taking several weeks. This machine will send me at the speed of light. I merely have to press the green button. Like others, I am nervous. Will it work? I remind myself what I've been told to expect. When I press the button, I shall lose consciousness, and then wake up at what seems a moment later. In fact, I shall have been unconscious for about an hour. The scanner here on Earth will destroy my brain and body while recording the exact states of all my cells. It will then transmit this information by radio. Travelling at the speed of light, the message will take 3 minutes to reach the replicator on Mars. This will then create, out of new matter, a brain and body exactly like mine. It will be in this body that I shall wake up. So it's just like Star Trek, if you ever saw the old Star Treks. So I believe that this is what will happen. Though I believe that this is what will happen, I still hesitate. But then I remember seeing my friend grin when at breakfast today I revealed my nervousness. As she reminded me, she's been often teletransported, and there was nothing wrong with her. I press the button. As predicted, I lose and seem at once to regain consciousness, but in a different cubicle. Examining my new body, I find no change at all. Even the cut on my finger is still there. Eventually, just like my friend, I've made many such trips with the teletransporter. Now I barely think about the process. It is as automatic as catching the spaceship used to be. So what does this mean? That I am not the physical matter of what I'm constituted. All of that can be replaced. There's no part of me that remains the same and has to remain identical over time to make me me. I find this thought reassuring. Let's say I was killed since using the teletransporter, but the information stored in the transmitter booth could be used to make me again. Once the information is in the system, I can be born again any time. So, that's a little story to motivate some thoughts about the relationship of you, if there is any you really, to the physical stuff of which you are made. Now, just have a chat with the person next to you. Let's say in the future such a device could be built. Would you be willing to try the teletransporter to make an urgent meeting which you would miss by normal travel? Just tell the person next to you, would you have your body physically completely destroyed and then the information used to reconstruct a new body, say 5 minutes later, an hour later? And bear in mind, the new body will be reconstructed exactly as it was, including, say, the cut on your finger, as in the story. Would you use that device? All right. Tell the person next to you what you think. Right, yes. Yeah. All right, so just out of interest, hands up if you would use the device. Hands up if you would use it. Yeah. All right, if you wouldn't use it. Okay, so there's a fairly even split there. So now, the other way of looking at it is, one way of looking at it is you're being reconstructed, and why not? Remember, your atoms are being replaced all the time. So what's the difference between your atoms being replaced all the time anyway, which is what's happening right now to you all the time, and replacing them all in one go, which is effectively what happens here. On the other hand, you might say, yeah, but what's the difference between being killed and this? Because my body is just destroyed. So what do you reckon? Is destroying you physically and reconstructing you exactly more or less the same as being killed? Which would be maybe the ones who wouldn't want to use it. Was that the way you were thinking about it? So just take the second question here and say what your answer is to that, to the person next to you. All right, so in Parfit's answer is more like a yes to the first one. What he's trying to motivate in his book, in his arguments, is it's not like being killed, although he can see where that intuition comes from. There is no you to be destroyed in the first place. There is just the connection of mental states, one after the other, and that connection is preserved in the teletransporter example. One set of states causing another set of states causing another set of states. That's all there ever is anyway, and we preserve that in the teletransporter example. So now, so that example sort of deals with the physical form, because if you're happy for you to be destroyed, the physical form to be destroyed, that is, and then reconstructed, then there's nothing physical that has to remain the same over time for you to be the same sort of creature or being that you are now. We can explore this further with this second thought experiment, thinking about how. Now, you don't have to accept the next thing I'm going to say, but you might do. It's sort of the scientific way of thinking about things. That all of your mental states depend on physical stuff, especially your brain. So if you change your brain, you change your mental states. Okay. That's sort of the presumption that much psychology, cognitive science is built on, and there's pretty good evidence for it when you monkey with the brain. Like, if you drink a lot of alcohol, you change your mental states. And there's nothing about your mental life you couldn't change, we can't monkey with, by changing something in the brain. So if you accept that, then think about this following example. Consider a surgeon who replaced a proportion of cells in your body. The change makes your brain and body more like Marilyn Monroe's. So that's Parfit's choice, but you could substitute another person in there of your choice. I'll carry on with Marilyn Monroe. As it was scanned completely one day when she was 30, if the surgeon changes 100% of the cells, the resulting person would start off thinking and looking exactly like Marilyn did on the day that she was scanned. But now imagine only 0.001% of the cells were changed. You would carry on thinking almost entirely as you did before the operation. Right? There's only a tiny change. You would be having the same tendency to think the same sorts of thoughts, have the same sorts of mental life as you have now. Your eyes might be a bit more like Marilyn's, and you might have a slightly more positive attitude towards show business than you had before. But otherwise, life would go on as it had done before. Now consider another 0.001% of cells were changed. The resulting person would think they were you and would be barely different from you. And for each tiny change we make, would any change mark the point when you suddenly cease to exist? Seems unlikely. It's just a lot of little changes, and each little change barely makes a difference, right? So you wouldn't suddenly cease to exist at any point in that transition. The person either side of any particular change would be almost the same. Just the odd flash of feeling, the odd image from memory, the odd opinion changes. But your feelings, memories, and opinions change subtly all the time anyway, as they are now. Just as a heap of sand is still a heap after the removal of a single grain, so there's no sudden change in your identity after a few cells are changed. There will be a point where you're more likely to say that you're Marilyn than your name now. But the difference between that point and the previous change would be minimal. And the person either side of that change would not feel they had ceased to exist because of the change. You can be changed to Marilyn Monroe or the Dalai Lama. There would never be a precise point where you would cease to be you. So that's the thought, that you can change gradually to, say, anybody else in this room. And at no point would you cease to be you in that transition. So, what do you think? Above and beyond the stream of mental states and the physical states that go with them, is there something in addition that makes you the same over time? Just discuss that with the person next to you. Okay, so the idea is here that because you can blend imperceptibly into anybody else, there is nothing about you that makes you you, because in that blending process you'd always consider you until you were just like the person sitting next to you. So Derek Parfit said he would particularly come back to that thought experiment, that was the Marilyn Monroe one, whenever he felt he was losing the intuition, and that helped him. See, if there's no, remember he said he didn't fear death so much anymore. Well, if there's no you that's identical that persists over time, what is there to die? There's a succession of mental states, but the whole world is full of a succession of mental states, and maybe we can be happy that other people live. So in the Buddhist scheme of things, what you have is one set of mental states at a given moment in time, defining what you're experiencing that moment in time, causing another set of mental states in the next period of time, causing another set of mental states in the next period of time, and so on. And that's what there is. There isn't a self in addition to this. There's just, as it were, thoughts without a thinker. And what we need to understand is the nature of the relationship between these states. So, for example, when our senses come into contact with their objects, that creates creates feelings, pleasant, neutral, or unpleasant sensations. And the nature, because these sensations are pleasant or unpleasant, that then creates things like craving. So if we have a pleasant feeling, we might say, I want more of that, and you have craving. Or if an unpleasant feeling, you might say, I need a pleasant feeling, I need to do something pleasant to overcome that. Or if you feel ill will towards someone, what you want to do is to create, what that means is you're seeing things as a separation between you and other people, and you're reinforcing that sense of separateness, and then that can create a craving to get rid of them, to harm them, and so on. So now, the problem with this particular set of causal relationships is it involves a sort of a self-deception, an illusion. Because when we crave, we think something will satisfy us, but what we haven't realized, because we haven't paid close enough attention to these causal relationships, is the thing we crave never will satisfy us, although we believe it will. And one reason we think it might satisfy us, or there's a presumption that when we think about it is obviously false. We think, let's say, we think there is some essence of our self, a core me, would like to bring things into the circle of me-ness and keep them there. And often when we crave, what we want is to bring something into the circle of me-ness and keep it there forever, with the belief that I'll exist forever, it will exist forever, and as long as this thing is here with me, then I'll be happy. But friendships, love, good tasting food, all these things we might want, a car, a house, and so on, none of them last forever. We change, they change. There isn't a enduring me anyway. There's nothing there to be identical, not in ourselves, and not in anything else at all. So the presumption, though we know it's false as soon as we reflect upon it, as soon as we we crave the muffin, if we bring the muffin into the circle of me-ness and we experience a taste of the muffin, somehow that might last, and then we'll be happy, finally. Or if only I changed my boyfriend, I got a new one, then I would be happy. Or if only I got that car, then I'll be happy. Of course, evolution has arranged that we'll never be happy. And Buddha didn't know about evolution, but we have a good evolutionary take on that now. We didn't evolve to be happy. We evolved to be running on a treadmill, to be always trying to get things, because that is how we got more children into the next generation. And so that's what evolved. So the problem with the self-illusion is the notion that there's an enduring self that can own things is part of, is what underlies the notion that, according to Gautama anyway, that if only we got something, we'll be eternally and lastingly happy and satisfied, you see, because there's an eternal self, and if this thing, if we then had it unchanging as well, then we'd be happy, right? Because we got what we want, and it'll be eternally the same forever. But there is no self. So when we try and construct a boundary between not self and self, we're constructing an illusion in which we're doomed to be unhappy with, because the boundary is false. There is no self. There is nothing that remains the same. There's this constant change. What we need to do is to drop the burden that we're constantly creating to separate self from no self. So why do we have this illusion? Well, there's, as I say, I'd say there's a good evolutionary story for that. We didn't evolve to be happy. We evolved to be constantly running after things, and we think we'll be happy if we get them because that makes us run after them. But evolution makes sure we're never content, because if we were content and sat down and were happy, we wouldn't get on and do other things. That's not quite the Buddhist answer, because they weren't aware of evolution. But the Buddhist answer, which I also think is a good answer, is we are not aware enough of our own mental states. That's what we now call metacognition, awareness of mental states. We rely on stories we tell about ourselves, which go over an extended period of time. Saying, I'm buying and eating that muffin I craved, I will finally be satisfied. So that event occurs over a fairly long period of time. There might be a narrative on a fairly smaller time scale. I'm eating part of that muffin now, and you think you'll be satisfied. But let's say you're paying attention to the sensations and feelings as they happen in each precise moment, and you're aware of the exact sensations that you're having in that very moment. Not the narrative you're spinning about it, but what's actually happening. What's the pleasure you're getting? How does it come and go? And if you paid attention to the actual pleasure and lack of pleasure and whatever is happening, the precise sensations in every precise moment, you'll notice how these positive sensations, they come and then they go. And you might notice just how fleeting the pleasures are. That it's at the very height of the pleasure that we're getting that it begins to then immediately dissipate. And then we might notice the gap between our beliefs and the reality that we face in every moment. So if that's part of how the illusion is maintained, how can we get rid of it? Well, by process of mindfulness, being aware of every moment. Mindfulness wasn't defined precisely in the early sutras, but it was metaphors and stories were told to give the idea. So here's how one way it was communicated 2,500 years ago. Mindfulness is like a man who must pay attention to a bowl brimful of oil that he's carrying on his head. I guess in those days people carried things on their head a lot. The man must do this before a crowd that is gathered to watch the most beautiful girl of the land as she dances and sings. And as the man moves between the girl and the crowd with the bowl on his head, he's followed by another man with a drawn sword, who, if he spills so much a drop of the oil, will cut his head off. In such circumstances, it is suggested, the man will pay very careful attention to the bowl of oil on his head. So that's when you're being mindful what you're going to do. You're going to pay very careful attention to the precise moment, to the exact sensations you're having, not being distracted by the crowd or the girl. So that's how you cultivate mindfulness of the body. You're not distracted by the pleasures and the pains and drawn into them. You just notice things exactly as they are. So mindfulness is holding in mind the object. You should, whatever you're paying attention to, whatever you're doing, your job in that moment, you're paying attention to it, but in a way in which you're indifferent to pleasure or pain, not being sucked into them. You attend with equanimity. So let's let's try that process, and in order to analyse this sequence here, so that you can begin to see for yourself a little bit of what Gautama is talking about. So, if you want to do what I'm about to suggest, you're welcome to, and if you don't want to, that's absolutely fine as well. Just sit there quietly. So to begin with, what I'd like to do is to just sit with a straight back and your eyes closed, and we're going to pay attention to the contact of senses with their objects, which just means the sensations that happen in your body. We could focus on something in particular, like your breath. So now, as you sit there, pay attention to your breath going in through your nose and your breath coming out of your nose. And just see if you can hold your attention on that object and see what's happening in each moment. Now, if your mind's distracted, that's absolutely fine. Just bring your attention back to the breath and see if you can hold the attention on the breath. Now, attending to exactly what's happening to the breath as it goes in and out, see if you can broaden your attention to your whole body and feel your whole body as you breathe. Maybe you notice the breath going through your nose. Maybe you feel at the back of your mouth or your throat. Maybe you feel your chest moving because of the breath. Maybe you notice your stomach moving because of your breath. And then feel sensations in your whole body as they are right now. Whatever sensation is happening in your whole body. Does the breath affect that part of the body? Now broaden your attention. So the breath is always there, and there's the body. Now you can broaden your attention to the area outside of your body as well, and just see what experiences are happening right now, what sounds there are. Anything that happens in your broad field of attention. As long as it's happening right now and you're paying attention to what's happening right now, then you're doing the task. All right. Now, we're going to move to the next step. So what you've just been practicing is just noticing sensations in your body and in your sense organs generally, which is the first set of mental states here. Now, just comment to yourself if the state that you're in, any particular thing that you're sensing, if it's pleasant, neutral, or unpleasant. But try not to be drawn into that. So you might have, for example, a thought that's very pleasant. But try not to be lost in a fantasy because of that. Or indeed a very unpleasant thought with lots of anger and whatever. Don't be drawn into that. Just notice whether it's pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. Let it be, and just keep on attending to the present moment and just commenting to yourself, is it pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral, while feeling equanimity towards those sensations. So you're not going to be drawn into anything, you're just going to note what it is and return your attention to the present moment. Go. Now notice that these pleasant, neutral, or unpleasant feelings that you have They depend completely on what your mind is contacting, as the Buddhists put it, what your sense organs are contacting, what thoughts your mind is contacting. And that's always changing. So whatever's pleasant or unpleasant is constantly changing. Pleasant goes to unpleasant, goes to pleasant. Or this is pleasant, and that is pleasant, and this is pleasant. There's a stream of change happening. So now think about, as you pay attention to your breath and things around you, does any desires arise in you, positive or negative? It's put here as craving. Craving means desires based on the illusion that you'll be satisfied, if only you could satisfy this desire, which frankly probably a little bit of that illusion in almost all the desires that we have. So just notice what desires arise in you, positive or negative, as you sit there. Do you desire to get over this exercise? Do you desire to eat something? What's happening in your mind just as you sit there, trying to pay attention to the current moment? As part of that current moment, what desires arise? Now think about, as those desires arise, what do they arise dependent upon? The Buddhist answer is they arise dependent upon the positive or negative feelings that you just had. That's what triggers the desire. So can you catch that process? Does that seem true to you? Did the desire arise because of a pleasant thought, a pleasant image, a pleasant sensation of some sort? Can you see that process in action? Just have a go. All right. So that was sort of a shortened and very brief, rather too brief version of a part of Buddhist meditation, which is meant to help one understand the process, not just understand at an intellectual level, but to sort of build it deep into how we experience our mental life. Another sort of process to understand is how kindness and compassion leads to greater sense of interconnectedness and reduced sense of me and mine. That's love and kindness meditation. So the aim of this sort of mindfulness meditation is to short-circuit some of these processes here, so you don't just react to them, but you become aware of them and become aware of exactly what's happening and how craving, for example, depends on a false sense, an illusion of there being a self, which doesn't exist. Coming to realize there is no self. So coming to want and desire things in a way in which we don't expect lasting satisfaction from any particular desire. We just know that from any sort of normal sort of desire, pleasant feelings will come and they will go. And that isn't the secret to happiness, to satisfy this particular desire or that particular desire. In fact, flourishing joy is not dependent on any particular set of contingent circumstances, like the partner one has, the car one has, the foods one eating, and so on. But when you fully realize the very changing nature of everything, not just realize it intellectually, but deep in our presumptions that are built into our mental states, we've changed all of that, so we see the world as changing, including ourselves. There is no self other than a changing set of mental states, and we see that there's just an interconnected pattern of causation that defines me as a person at this particular point. Then apparently the claim is, that leads to a joy that is no longer conditioned on any particular set of circumstances in the world. And so that does, in a sense, give you lasting satisfaction because it's conditioned on the truth of the way things are. Just complete change all the time without any self. At least that's the claim. Whether it's true or not, obviously, I'm going to leave you to decide. All right, thanks very much.